how many of you remember that that today? How many remembered yesterday throughout the week that it's the married class that's taking place over there? Raise your hand, those of you that remembered that. And so therefore, how many of you remember that I'm to teach this class today? Everybody raise their hand. I didn't remember it until last night about 8 o'clock. I got a text. It's like, oh, I forgot that. So anyway, here we are. Good to see you. Good to be here. I hope to bring a lesson this morning that is applicable to all. I had a number of topics that I've been studying, and we're about to launch into the book of Romans. And I was this close to bringing a lesson, maybe an introductory type of lesson toward the book of Romans, but I'm afraid that I might steal some of the wind for our preacher's sails. So I didn't do that. I came real close, so that's where a lot of my personal study has been going here lately, is toward the book of Romans. Very interesting book, a very challenging book. Some have said it's the most difficult book in the Bible. I was stuck on verse 17 for about 3 weeks, trying to figure out a phrase in there. And I think that I finally figured it out. I haven't burned it in well, but eventually, by the time we start that class and get to that verse, I believe we all have it well under wrap. Anyway, I've been studying some other topics. One that I started studying that I'm not going to bring in this morning, I've been studying a little bit about one of the specific denominations' teachings, and that is the Jehovah's Witnesses. And I'm not going to bring that lesson today. Another one that I have was teaching. It's very similar to something I have taught a while back. And it's similar to that, and it's in conjunction. And I'm really surprised that in the bulletin today, Jimmy Clark, his lesson is on there, Lessons Learned Through Suffering. For those of you who remember, some time back, I did bring a lesson on suffering in this class, maybe 1 or 2 different lessons. But in my personal studies, I came up on another story in the Bible that kind of brought that topic or subject back up in the forefront of my mind, and I studied into it. And I would like to discuss that, because there's a few different approaches or thoughts concerning affliction and adversity. And one of the questions I asked myself, and may ask you, and maybe even title the lesson, Understanding Adversity. Ask yourself that question. Can we understand adversity? Let me tell you this. There is no correct answer. There is no. Matter of fact, if you look at Jimmy Clark's lesson, he says the answer is not with men. Okay? The answer about adversity is with God. We can have a good understanding of it. Okay? Eventually. And one of the characters we'll talk about will bring this thought out just a little bit more. I don't know how long ago it was. It may have been on a Wednesday night. We discussed some of the adversities and some of the benefits of suffering in adversity. And when you study the topic of adversity, you almost simultaneously need to study the topic of the providence of God. Do we get that? Often when we study and discuss and think about the topic of adversity and suffering, we need to also, right behind it, coupled with it, joined with it, we need to study the topic of the providence of God. Now, with that being said, your minds are rolling. I can see the sawdust burning, little smoke signals going up. Okay, where would you say would probably be? And what's this one I discussed? What is probably one of the first characters in our Bible that we would go to study as a study case for adversity, affliction, and suffering? And that is, it is coupled with the providence of God. Joseph. Excellent. We all know that story. A wonderful, wonderful story. Joseph in his coat of many colors, and very excellent, very enjoyable story. We teach it to our little ones. Very beneficial. We tell them about all that he went through. We know those stories. I won't have time to go through and to discuss that, but I want to review a couple of passages as we think about Joseph and all that he went through, and then how did it all wound up? What was the end result? How did it all turn out? Let's think about the topic of adversity. Is it detrimental to man? Is it the end? Or is it only a part of our transition period? It admonishes us. It teaches us. It encourages us. And it can save us. Sometimes it takes a fiery trial in our lives to get us on the right path. Sometimes adversity, even though it might be most grievous for the moment, it is for our own well-being. For our own well-being. Let's look at some passages in Genesis chapter 45. This is the summation of the thoughts that took place. As the story goes, Joseph, he was hated by his brothers, and Joseph was having these visions that were sent to him by God, and he would go and tell his brethren about that, and they hated him as a result of that. Who is this? He was almost the youngest out of all of his brothers, almost the youngest except for Benjamin, and one of his dreams was what? Remember the story about the ears of corn, or the corn stalks, or whatever, what they would do? How the others would bow down to his? What was that a signature? What did that represent? Or what was that a signal of? Or what was that foretelling? That his brethren would do what? They would bow down to him one day. They understood what he was saying. They didn't believe it. So what did they do? We're going to kill him at first. We're going to kill him at first, but of course they put him they threw him in a pit and sold him into slavery. And his daddy understood that his daddy thought that he had been killed by a wild animal and grieved for all those years. Okay? And little side note thought right here. When his father Jacob grieved over the loss of Joseph, was his emotion genuine? Say yes. Okay? Was his emotions based upon fact? Absolutely not. Moral of the story is what? We can't allow our emotions to determine the truth or determine what we teach, believe. Okay? Emotions are involved. If not, you got to take love out of it. Okay? But emotions are not our guiding principle by no means. Okay? They're there for a reason. God gave those to us. God experiences those emotions. Okay? All right. So let's look at some verses here. Genesis chapter 45. Genesis 45. At the end of this, we know the story how that they all eventually come together, and Joseph is second to Pharaoh. He is the governor of the land. He is the very most powerful being almost in the world at that time, because there was a great famine in the land, and all the other countries were coming to Egypt for food and necessity. But they had seen, Joseph had seen, or was understood that there was going to be a famine coming, right? So they started to stockpile food as a result of that. So many came back, and also with Joseph's brethren came. They didn't know him at first, we know the story, but eventually he reveals himself to them. Let's go to that one when he finally reveals himself to them. In Genesis chapter 45, beginning in verse 1. Genesis 45 and 1. Then Joseph could not refrain himself before all of them that stood by him. And he cried and caused every man to go out from him. And there stood no man with him, while Joseph made himself known to his brethren. And he wept loudly, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard. Joseph said to his brethren, I am Joseph, doth thy father yet live? And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. Joseph said unto his brethren, Come near me, I pray you. They came near, and he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves, that ye sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life. Okay? We can go even to chapter 50. He tells his brethren, you meant it for evil, but God meant it to save many. God did this to save many. But those persecutions, those trials, that tribulation, the affliction that Joseph suffered, was it real? Was it terrible? Was it awful? Should it not have happened? By worldly standards, no, it should never have happened. Brethren selling their brethren into slavery should never have happened. And then the atrocities that took place, I guess you would say, Potiphar's wife, and how it was that the butler forgot to, once he was free from the prison, forgot to tell the Pharaoh about Joseph in prison, so he suffered in prison for that many more years. All those various different things. But he goes on to tell them here, basically saying, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. So you have this affliction, right? He suffered it. It was real. It was true. And then there's the providential hand of God coming in there. That was God's plan. We can ask ourselves, does that parallel to some of our experiences today? I don't think any afflictions that I suffered would be equal to that. I just don't, I can't see that. I better watch out. I might jinx myself. But, and I don't think that I'll ever be second to Pharaoh. I don't think I'll ever be the vice president of the United States. Okay? I like to, well, I don't need to go there. Anyway, but we all do suffer. And I believe that today God's providential care still exists. God's providential care does still exist. He provides for it. Many people were going to die from the famine. As a result of that, many people were saved from the famine. Okay? Now, that's just one example. Afflictions being coupled or paralleled with the providential care of God. Joseph did not understand all that time, but it's very interesting. Notice as you read and study that life, that story in the Old Testament, at no time did you see Joseph become bitter or angry, do you? There's no record that I see, not a word, not a hint, where Joseph become bitter. Have y'all noticed any? Point it out. If you have, I may have overlooked something. I do not see anywhere. As a matter of fact, when he was put into those adverse conditions, he excelled, did he not? When he was put in prison, I believe that the favorable hand of God was upon him, but he drew the favor of his captors every time. And I cannot find one ounce of negativity in all of his responses or his actions. Cannot find it. The only response that I see is right here when he met up with his brethren. No vengeance. No vengeance taken. No anger. Only but love. He said he could not restrain himself. That to me explains a whole lot about his character. Now let's go to another character. Another biblical character. This is the one that kind of engaged my attention to study this topic once again. One that I necessarily had not considered, but it does mention and bring to light the topic of affliction, and therefore followed by and coupled with the topic of the providential care of God. Let's go to the book of Ruth, Let's go to the book of Ruth. We're going to read the first chapter. At least that way we get a lot of Bible in our lesson today. We're going to read chapter 1, hopefully all the way through to chapter 2, verse 1. Okay? I want to read those because this is just a compelling story. It's wonderful. Now, we might not always study this book. It might be a little bit, you may have to kind of brush off the dust off of it a little bit because we might not study this topic that often. The story of Ruth. Verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled. There's our time signature right there. During the period of judges, before the period of the United Kingdom, there was a famine in the land. Okay? All right, there's what's happening across the country. And there was a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab. Okay? Why do you think he went to sojourn in the country of Moab? Right there in the text. They were looking for food, sustenance, right? They're kind of trying to survive, were they not? There was famine in the land, so they go. These are Hebrew people moving out. Israelites moving out. Now, moving out of the promised land. Moab, who is Moab? Who are the Moabites? Are they a kindred to the Israelites? Who are they? Where's the connection here? Moab and Ammon were the two children of whom? Lot's two children, right? Remember the story? Moab and Ammon. Okay, so those are a kindred nation. All right, let's move on. He and his wife and his two sons, they're going on a journey. There's a famine in the land. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the name of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. Does that ring a bell? Bethlehem, Ephratah, Bethlehem, Judah. They were from that. Who else was from that? Who else was from Bethlehem? Ephratah, Bethlehem, Judah. All right, right. Anyway, moving on. And they came into the country of Moab and continued there. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. Woo! So they're number one. There's a famine in the land. We got to leave, man. Folks are going to die. We've got to go find food. We've got to survive. I believe that's the impetus for them moving out and leaving out. So they go out. That's bad enough. Wouldn't it be terrible if we had to, one day, because there was a huge famine in the United States, that we either had to go to Canada or Mexico because there's no food in the United States? There's no work, there's no employment, there's no way to sustain a living in the United States. Wouldn't that be terrible to have to do? And then when we get there, our people start dying off. Our loved ones. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. Somebody say something? It might be echoing. Okay? Let's see. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left, and her two sons. And they took them wives of the women of Moab. Was that an issue? What were the Israelites told to do? As far as marriage, where were they supposed to, where was the candidacy for their marriage held? Of their own. Okay, of their own. Okay? And the name of one was Ophrah, and the other was Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Displacement from their homeland for 10 years. That's a good long while. Away from your home because there's no food in land for 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them. Her two sons died. Now that's a challenge right there when a parent has to bury the child or the children. Imagine there's some of us in this audience. I can't think of one now, but I imagine there's some of us here that have experienced that. It's the other way around, is it not? It should be. Out of time? What'd you say? Out of time. It's out of time. So let me tell you, that's pretty rough. Famine in the land. They have to go and try to survive somewhere in a foreign country. They get out there and her husband dies. How devastating. And then her sons, her children died. I don't know how that I could respond to that. I don't know how that I would respond. I hope I would. I'm not sure. Anyway, left her with her 2 sons and her husband. Anyway, then she arose with her daughter-in-laws that she might return from the country of Moab. For she had heard that the country of Moab, how that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. What's happening? What's happening back in Israel? They're getting bread. In other words, the Lord is starting to bless them. The famine is ceasing over in Palestine. Okay? If you study your maps, I'm going to have to turn around this way. If you're looking at Israel, you got the Mediterranean Sea, and you got Israel right here. Okay? Over here to the lower right is where Moab would be. Okay? The lower right. That's why you might see me point down here, something like that. All right. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return into the country. The Lord had visited his people and given them bread. The famine was over in Judah. Okay? And Naomi said unto her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each of you to her mother's house. The Lord dealeth kindly with you as ye have dealt with the dead and with me. In other words, you've done a good service to me. I really appreciate it. You have been great daughter-in-laws. Now go back to your families. Okay? Go back to your families. A time of adversity for Naomi. And she's telling those daughter-in-laws to go back home. Okay?
You talk about having to leave and go somewhere else to get more work. In the 50s, quite a bit. Down where I live, down in Pulaski, people left and went to Nashville to get a job. So they could get them later on in the 60s from the country. I'm not saying anything bad. Good job in Nashville. But the reason they got prospect later and all those jobs coming all over. So that's a different place over to Alabama, which was a good place, but they had to get a better life. They had to move.
Right. My ancestors, my parents on my mother's side, they went up north in the Michigan car plants to work, but come back. I don't think they stayed very long at all. They were basically, on my mother's side, they were sharecroppers and timber cutters. They lived in the Mississippi River bottoms up in Tipton County. They lived out there in the floodplains. Their houses were on stilts because it would flood under their house. Not where I'd want to be during a flood. Anyway, excellent thought though. Yes, people have to leave to go find work, sustenance. Let's see. She tells her daughters to go back. He said, The Lord grant you that ye may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said unto her, Surely we will return with thee to thy people. We're going to go with you, the 2 daughters-in-law said. Naomi said, And turn again, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there any more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters. Go your way. I am too old to have an husband. If I would say, I have hope, if I should have a husband, also tonight, should bear sons, would you tarry with them till they were grown? Would you stay for them from having husbands? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. All right, now we're starting to get into a little bit of the understanding of the mindset of Naomi. Okay, what we understand what happened, the great adversity. The daughter-in-laws want to go with her. She tells her to go and stay. She kind of gives some reason. Why did she say something about if I have a husband and have sons? What is that discussion leading toward there? They have no reason to stay with her. But how did God provide basically, how were people provided for in those days? Husbands, sons, okay? Naomi was a destitute widow. Are there provisions in the New Testament concerning destitute widows? Widows indeed. Widows indeed. Would she be a widow indeed? Sons were gone. Who would she be who would be responsible for her care today? The church would. The church would be responsible for that, for a widow indeed. But if they have family and sons and children, who's responsible there? Family is. Family is. Anyway, that's the way of stuff. Back in those days, if you did not have helpers, children, grandchildren to help you in your retired years when you can't get up and move and walk and feed yourself, you were in a world of trouble, were you not? And she was seeing this.
Go back in our history, 50 years, people, they took care of their parents when they got older, brought them in their homes.
In their homes.
They kept them there for life. Well, now we get somewhere else. It's a different time.
Yeah. We have more at our disposal. We have a lot more at our disposal. But often that which is at our disposal becomes a disposal. You know what I mean? Disposal. But that was the way that it's set up. Children would take care of the parents. Okay? And she says to them, why are you hanging on to me? You're in trouble. You better get busy, remarry, start your life, because one day you're going to be destitute just like me. Stay here, remarry, get you another husband, have children. Okay? Because I can't have any. I'm not going to have any more. I'm too old. You wouldn't wait for them anyway if I did. If I were to marry somebody tonight, you won't wait. Anyway, verse 14. Look now, let's address this. Look at that last sentence. Okay, that last sentence. I want to compare her attitude to Joseph's attitude. And then also we're going to discuss, if time allows, we're going to look at Job's attitude toward affliction and suffering. Okay? We're looking at Ruth's attitude, or at least the way that it very much so appears. How does she respond here? Look at the very last phrase. For it grieveth me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out what? Against me. Who's getting the blame here? Who's getting the blame for the affliction that she is suffering? God is. How do we respond to adversity in our lives? That'd be the biggest question. Do I respond like Joseph did? Do I respond like Ruth did? And when I'm in a very serious affliction, we can respond like Job did. Several times you will see to the scriptures where Judge said that Job did not sin with his mouth. Job did not sin through all of this. But he questioned God. He questioned God. The humanity of Job comes out in there. Let me tell you, that was some unbearable suffering. And I would not dare to say, Job, you messed up, because I would be right with his three buddies, right? Eliphaz, Zophar, and Bildad. They accused him, saying, Job, the reason you're suffering is because God is getting retribution right now for the way that you have lived. We know that it was not so. But did Job understand why he was suffering? He did not. And so he knew that he was righteous before God, that he obeyed God, that he was obedient to God. And the norm of the day, the philosophy of the day was, suffering is a result of retribution of God against those that sin against him. And so Job he holds on, it seems like, by a thread. And toward the end, he questions God. And I love the way that God responds to him. He says, Job, stand up. Gird up thy loins and answer me these questions. Man, if the Lord, of course we're not talking about miraculous events today, but when the God of the universe, when the creator of the universe says, get up, Raymond, I want you to answer me. We would fall flat, wouldn't we not? Of course, that's not going to happen today. Stand up. He says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? the earth was formed. Who are you to question? Later on, Job says, I've sinned. And he said, I repent. He repents of that. In the latter parts of the book. We'll go there in a few minutes, Mom. Let's once again, I know I jumped a little bit ahead in my thoughts, but I had to cover Job. If not, it wouldn't have been a complete lesson in my mind. Okay, you with me? Now, let's once again look at Naomi's behavior. Okay? She tells him to go back. We know the story of Ruth. We know the story of Ruth, how that she hangs on. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. Where you die, I will die. I'll be buried where you're buried. Okay? Now, that's a great, wonderful story. Goes on to say, so Naomi, let's go down to verse, let's see, 19. So they two went until they came to Bethlehem. And it came to pass when they were come to Bethlehem that all the city was moved about them, everybody, all the women, okay? And it was said, is this Naomi? And she said unto them, call me not Naomi. My name is Mara, for the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me. Who does she continue to blame? God. I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Why call ye me Naomi? Seeing the Lord hath testified against me, and the Almighty hath afflicted me. She didn't handle it right, did she? I don't think she did. I think she had faulty judgment here, a faulty response. Naomi returned, and Ruth returned to Moabitess. We know the story. Look in chapter 2. And Naomi had a kinsman, her husband's, a mighty man of wealth, family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. We know the rest of that story. You see the providence of God stepping in right here after all this? Despite Naomi's attitude and mindset, of which is an example for us how not to respond to affliction. Keep blaming God.
Don't you think God understands to a point when you're suffering that you're going to doubt?
I think so. He saw it in Job. Excellent point. Excellent point.
Because when you are suffering like that, you find comfort in nothing.
He sees the humanity. We can find comfort. Understanding affliction is wisdom. Let me get a verse and I'm going to get to you. Hopefully we do this. Let's go to James chapter 2. James chapter 2. My brethren, verse 2. Count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, when you fall into trials. Count it joy. Ooh, that sounds hard. Knowing this is trying of your faith work at patience, that patience have a perfect work, that you may be complete and wanting. If any of you lack wisdom, I'm addressing that, what you just mentioned. Wait a minute. What do you mean? What does it mean? If you don't see the benefit in this, if you don't have the wisdom of God, if you can't understand what's going on, pray to God about it. Pray to God. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God that giveth unto all men liberally. Job never saw the reasoning why, never understood. Unless he was the writer of the book of Job at the very end, he saw the entire story of what took place in the throne room. Okay? He never understood. Why am I suffering this? He never understood, but never falsely charged God. Questioned, but never falsely charged God. We may have questions.
Sometimes you don't ever really get past that line. I mean, there's a reason God does it, but you don't get past.
Well, we never see the benefit of it. We never ever see the benefit, but in the overall scheme of all, we know that it's God's plan. Yes.
And kind of one of the verse I was just looking at a moment ago, we talk about Romans 8, about 24 to 28. It's talking about depending basically on things we do not see. We hope on things we do not see, therefore it's better. And then also talks about how the Spirit intercedes for us in prayers, even though we do not see them.
We have an intercessor. Excellent thought. I'm glad you brought that up.
And on the very last part of it, in the conclusion that I said God causes all things to work together for those who love the Lord, those who are called according to His purpose, because He knows the mind of the Spirit and the hearts of men.
I was going to go to a lot of Paul's teachings on this. Paul addresses, he knew suffering. He talks about something, and what it is, we have an intercessor sometimes that just makes known our groanings. What you're talking about is our groanings. We don't know how to express it. We don't fully grasp it and all that. We have an intercessor.
We know there's a reason, we just don't understand.
We're in a body of turmoil. And the Holy Spirit, our intercessor, He understands, He interprets on our behalf. So that we take comfort there. We can't quite explain it. We don't understand it. But God covers it for us. Okay? He covers it for us. And we're not going to be tempted above that which we cannot resist, can we? When you go to Paul's teachings in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, let's read that. That should be our very last verse. As we suffer, 1 Corinthians 10:13, there hath no temptation, trial, or tribulation, okay, suffering, affliction, taking you such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that which ye are able, but will with the temptation make a way of escape, that ye may be able to bear it. I might not fully understand I might not have enough wisdom in this little pea brain to understand what is going on. I'll trust in God. There is my answer right there. I'll trust in God that my intercessor will explain it to him on my behalf. All right? Any questions? Any thoughts? Any comments? I appreciate your kind attention. Thank you.